Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this latest teaching session in the course on technology and the future of medicine. Today is one of my favorite sessions. It's entitled Evil as a Treatable Disease, and Earle Waugh will take you through a critique of Simon Baron-Cohen's book called The Science of Evil, which is about evil as something like Asperger's or various other treatable problems, and the possible criticisms of that interpretation. The end of November, November 28th, I'm speaking at Nerd Night. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with Nerd Night. It mixes science and entertainment and humor, and it's held in the Citadel Theater. And this is an actual picture of Nerd Night. You can see actual human beings that you recognize there, myself and Ross and Jason and so on. And I'll probably end up talking about the course in a humorous, entertaining way. At least that's the attempt. So if you're interested, you could come. Most of the audience is young people of approximately your age. You can see there are a few older people there, but it's mostly a young crowd. And you may want to come and witness this. I hope it goes well. I'm meeting with the guy who runs Nerd Night tonight, and we're going to negotiate what I'm going to do. So anyway. Now, you may never before today, yes, Jason? Yeah.
On the topic of Nerd Night, will you be selling tickets after you talk about it?
I don't think I'm directly selling tickets, no. But Ross is more part of, the organization of the thing. He was a big promoter of Nerd Night last term, and nobody ended up going, so it was a rather unsuccessful part of the course. But we've corrected that this year, and it will be a more active and successful part of the course. And you'll end up, even if you don't go yourself, you'll hear rumors of what happened. So anyway, technology skeptics. I began planning this course with the idea that there are two classes of people, or maybe three in the world, but technology advocates, technology skeptics, and other people. And I had identified Earle Waugh as one of the best technology skeptics around. And that's a much too simple view of the world, because now what's happened is Earle has become quite, enamored of many technology topics. And in my email inbox, the person most likely to send me email about some new exciting technology thing is Earle Waugh. On the other hand, Jonathan White, who you will meet later, began as a tech advocate and probably the most interesting person to listen to about all the exciting things that were happening with science fiction and the technological singularity, but he's had a change of heart, and now he's a kind of skeptic. And so it just proves that life is not as simple as you think. You can't put people in just one category, but the other thing is that people within the course and the 2-year period that we've taught the course are undergoing a sort of dynamic change, which is quite interesting. So you can see where Earle is in the course of his own dynamic change today. So a balanced approach is what we're trying to come up with. I think that's what works in the real world, and what will work for you. If you took a course that was all about rah-rah technology and had nothing about skepticism and old-fashioned values, that would be of less value to you. In the teaching of this course, I've learned a lot about such things as karma and the cyclical view of life, and those are very old ideas, but valuable ones. And so it is useful to look at everything through the singularitarian lens. It's also equally useful to have a good handle on alternative ways of looking at things, being able to craft talking points that work for all audiences and situations. And hopefully in this course you will learn how to do that, and it will serve you well. Not only the students, but even the videographer, I think, will serve her well. So anyway, Earle Waugh helps to provide that perspective. He's a very modest guy, and so you may have noticed that although he's giving the presentation, his name doesn't appear on his PowerPoint till the very end, leaving you in suspense about who is this person.
So, I am your resident dissident. So, if you decide that you want to go to sleep now, then find a nice, comfortable spot and, just don't snort so loud that the rest of us are going to wake up. On the other hand, my dissidence arises out of probably a field that you would find very interesting, because you see, I trained at the University of Chicago, and I trained in an area of what is known as Divinity School, and I trained there as a historian of culture and religion, and specifically I trained in an analysis of Middle East and Islamic culture, and I added to my understanding of what I was to be doing something about Aboriginal traditions. And so when I came to the University of Alberta, I came as chair of a religious studies department. And during my time doing that, I began exploring aspects of medical perspectives, especially with regard to the ethical issues involved in those and how religion and science became intertwined. And so what I'm going to present to you today is a kind of skeptical view of one small study, and I hope you will understand that what I'm trying to do is to point out to you some larger issues that are fundamental to this field and in fact are critical in any kind of development of it. The central issue that we're addressing here in Baron-Cohen's thesis is, can we account for ethical behavior in brain circuitry? Can we, in fact, apply a scientific modeling to the brain? And if we can do that, can we then explain some of the larger perspectives in human history, and especially that of evil? Now, if you've read Simon Baron-Cohen's book, you'll know that he argues that you can. He wants to affirm then that he can apply some kind of scientific analysis to human behavior on a grand scale, so much so that we can define what it is that is evil by looking at the circuitry in the brain. Now, his own field of background, in order to give you a little bit of background if you haven't read his book, he is a specialist in autism. And he has done a great deal of work in understanding how autism works, and Asperger's in addition to that. And he has, from his perspective then, he has applied his work in autism to the larger kind of cultural issue of violence. In fact, just before I came up here, I was looking at a Medscape article that argued that their research shows that the circuitry in the brain that is used for empathy is closely allied with and travels in much the same way as violence does. And so there's perhaps scientifically some kind of coherence between the autistic and anti-empathetic behavior and violent behavior. So there seems to be something to his thesis. But what he is trying to do then is to jump from that to what he calls cultural analysis on a large scale. And this is an area where I have really specific difficulties. A number of issues arise out of this, and here are some of the issues that he details in his analysis. Of course, you're all too young to know about Hitler. Well, I mean, I'm giving you the benefit of the doubt, man. Hitler is picked as the prime example of an evil person, of an evil individual. May I ask you to just be a little skeptical about that? For this reason, that Hitler is a tool and an expression of Western civilization. And it might be, in fact, possible that evil and defining evil is not something that can be rested within what I would call the Judeo-Christian Islamic environment of Western civilization. That means then that I'm raising questions about the cultural definition of evil. The second thing that he talks about, of course, is the violence of the herd. Now, since you're all very placid here and perhaps even asleep, you would know then that the herd mentality that we're talking about is something that happens like at the Stanley Cup playoff time, when everybody, goes absolutely bananas, and especially Vancouverites, when their team absolutely collapses in the final, right? I mean, we live in Edmonton, so we know about collapsed teams. But the fact of the matter is that in Vancouver, the herd ran the show. And in fact, then, from Baron-Cohen's perspective, there is something in the behavior of humans in this kind of herd that cannot be accounted for under what we would call normal behavior. And then, of course, are the killing of innocents. I mean, we have a very pertinent and important one in Syria in the last month. An absolutely devastating gas attack that killed more women and children than other forms of debacle in that country. So, in effect, then, the wanton killing of innocents for him is an expression of an evil that is present in human culture. And I won't go through all of these, but I just want to point out to you that for Baron-Cohen, this indicates that there is a continuing structural issue that's going on in the human brain, and that structural issue can be very, very evil, he thinks. So I want to see how many of you have ever been beaten up by a bully. Okay, holy cow, just about everybody. Well, I had to wrestle with this issue of evil when I was very young, like when I was in grade school. And I don't know if others have heard this story before. I know that Kim has, but I want to tell it to you again because I want to put it in the context of why I feel so passionate about being a dissident from Simon's view of things. Because you see, I grew up in Ontario in a country farming rural area where there was 2 or 3 huge farmers, very important farmers, that lived back the road from us. And you probably can guess by the color of my hair that it was so long ago that I grew up in a one-room school. And so in a one-room school, the teacher had all of these different grades, and I guess you would say that I was the teacher's pet, because I always got good marks, and I was always had all my assignments done, and I always did everything I was supposed to do. So it wasn't just that I was a nerd that cheesed off Georgie Fluter. It wasn't just that I was, as you could see now, a little runt of a guy that probably couldn't beat his way out of a paper bag. But the fact was that for Georgie and his colleagues, he thought I was the epitome of slime. That is, too much on the teacher's good list, too much of a goody-goody, and I had to be taught my lesson. Well, you see, Georgie belonged to a fairly large family, and they farmed back the line from us, and he was built like, the proverbial backhouse. He was about as strong as I was weak. And we had to walk together back the road because I lived halfway back towards where he lived, and on the way there, Georgie thought that he would just give me a lesson in life. And so for several weeks on end, I would walk back road going home, and I would have the living daylights beaten out of me. It became so bad, in fact, that the teacher contacted my parents and said, I want to keep Earle at school until Georgie and his colleagues have gone home. Now, my father wasn't very happy about that. My father said, well, he's got to learn to fight. Yeah, sure. Yeah, have you ever heard that story? Yeah, he's got to learn how to fight. So I walked home with him the next time, and man, did I get beaten up. I was absolutely black and blue. My eyes were black. I was pounded. I hated that guy. I hated him, the very sight of him, I hated him. So I went home and I told my parents, you know what? I hate that guy so much that I hope he dies. Well, the next week I went to school. And the following weekend, Georgie and his family were traveling to Hamilton to go to church. Sunday morning, they went up over the crest of a hill, and they were hit head-on by a truck, and George was dead. Well, when I went to school, everybody knew what I had said. And they looked at me as if, has this guy got some kind of supernatural power? How can he make that kind of hope come true that quickly? So put yourself in my shoes. I had to go to school and sit there while we underwent grieving exercises and discussions about how nice George had been and what a great guy he was. And we had to go to the funeral in the church and sit there, and everybody had to feel sorry for George. Well, you can imagine I was torn up, pretty badly torn up. I didn't know what to think. I mean, I wasn't that old, maybe 8, 9, 10, something like that. So I wasn't able to put myself through all of this stuff and to understand what was going on. I tell you all this to point out to you that you can be evil without having your brain in some kind of situation that causes it. In other words, we're talking about a system that is much larger than what I would call hardwiring. We're talking about the relationship of the way emotions work on intellect and a whole slew of things. So why do people lack empathy? Let's look at some of the things that he comes up with. And here is a quick summation of the thesis of his book. Evil and cruelty are the result of the lack of empathy. They are not the result of a theological category of sin. In other words, if you're a Christian, then you know very well the fact that all evil and all sin has been, in some way or other, gone back to Adam, the first individual on earth, according to the Christian and Jewish and Islamic theology, and that sin came into the world at the beginning of time. At least for the Christians, that's where it came into the world. And so from then on, when we see an evil deed, that is the result of sin. Baron-Cohen says, no, it's not that, and it's not even the result of evil incarnate. And if you're part of Western cultural tradition, then you'll know that we have a long-standing commitment to the devil. He handles all kinds of neat things for us. When we can't explain something else bad, then we can trot out the devil. And there's no doubt that the devil gets blamed for an awful lot of stuff that he doesn't do. So the fact of the matter is, from Simon's perspective, you cannot then say that the devil is the cause of cruelty and evil. Now that flies in the face, of course, of Christian tradition, but that doesn't matter. Not purely the result of social disorder or environment. And here is the other thing. You probably know from your studies in social science that social scientists want to argue that evil is actually the result of either poverty or some other kind of behavioral system. He wants to argue against that. Then he wants to argue against the fact that this is the result of a physical condition. That is, this is not endemic to the whole human race. It is not a physical condition that is universal. So therefore, it is not something that all of us have to deal with. i.e., if I can go back to the Christian idea again, it is not there because Adam and Eve ate the apple. What it is, he thinks, is a reflection of various categories and association. And here are 4 areas that he thinks indicates why we can discuss evil. There are 4 kinds of conditions in which people exhibit lack of empathy, okay? There's psychopathy, there's narcissism, there's autism and Asperger syndrome. So in all of these areas, he argues, there are indications of a system at play that goes beyond what we would understand as a cultural motif. It is something that is rooted in the way people are thinking. So if you look at the various regions of the empathy circuit, which is discussed in his book, you can see that there are various areas in which the human brain contributes to empathy. So here is his argument from the empathy circuit. He argues there is a circuit in the brain. I'm going around his description of that circuit. If you want to look it up, have a look at his book. But he argues on the basis of his work in autism that he can trace pretty well what he calls the 6 levels of empathy. And here are some of the ways in which he talks about it. So there is MRI evidence in regions of the brain that are operative in empathy, and there are 10 of them in all. You can see all of them listed here. From his perspective then, all of these circuits indicate some degree of involvement in anti-empathetic behavior. All of those circuits then, he said, indicate something fundamental about the way that the brain is wired. So for autism, for people who are suffering from autism, then the lack of empathy there can be quantified. And he can follow this with an MRI to determine how active these circuits are and what is not functioning from a standpoint of empathy. And he comes up then with these zero negative definitions of people who lack empathy. There's the type B people like Marilyn Monroe. These are extremes. They say destructive things to others, i.e. they say all kinds of things to others that nobody in their right mind would say. Or there are those who are obviously psychopathic, which he calls type P. These have total detachment from anybody else's feelings. They are cold, they are calculating, they are completely selfish, they focus entirely on themselves, and when you try to argue with them, they have no recognition of what you are talking about. Then there's the type N, narcissistic, a total entitlement of self and using of others and discarding those who are useless. I was amazed to read the other day in a newspaper that says that today's world is one of the most narcissistic in history. And if that is in fact the case, then from Simon's perspective, we're all veering into the autistic realm. Then he says there are zero positive areas of analysis. There's Asperger's syndrome. So the Asperger syndrome is really an avoidance kind of thing. It's an avoidance of any kind of engagement. It is a system of loneliness. It's an obsession with being without social contacts. It is a rejection of people totally. In another era, I was a chief researcher for the Alberta Caregivers Association. And we did some research with people who were caregivers, specifically with young carers who had grown up to be 18 years old and who could talk to us without the ethics people getting too upset. So I talked to a young chap who was suffering from Asperger's, and the interesting thing about him is that he was the only care person for his mother. So I sat down at a restaurant with him and I said, okay, tell me how you feel about being a caregiver. He said, you know what? I hate it. He said, I see the suffering that my mother has, but I hate looking after her. And he said, I resent the fact that I have spent so much of my life taking care of my mother that I really don't have any life left for myself. And he said, as far as I'm concerned, if there was any way I could get away from caring for my mother, I would do it. Well, you can understand that I was somewhat shocked. From Simon Baron-Cohen's perspective, this is not unusual. This is, in fact, an example of a pattern, a brain pattern. And finally, from his work in autism, he argues that there is, in fact, in all autistic people, an underactivity in empathy. And many of the things that we think are associated with empathetic things, like, oh, I'm sorry, did that hurt? Or is there something I can do to help you? Or what happened? You know, is there a way that I can assist you? All of these words that we have learned, you know, at our mother's knee on how to deal with other people, all of those words are missing from the vocabulary of people who are held to be autistic. And he argues then that there are all kinds of relationships that are going on there. I won't take time to do that. All right, so here is his final conclusion. He sees in the aggressiveness gene, I don't know how many of you know about MAOA-H. MAOA-H is a gene that is overwhelmingly present among the Maori people in New Zealand. And if you know the Maori people, you'll know that they have a reputation for being incredibly bellicose. Now, it's just not on the football field that you see these guys, expressing this, but if you've ever watched the New Zealand Football Club, you'll understand what we mean, because they are big, they are tough, and they don't take no for an answer. They are just right full in your face. Well, the interesting thing about these people is that they have this gene that's identified with this kind of warrior complex. Then he goes on to analyze the impact of other kinds of things on the circuitry. And he talks about serotonin transporter. These various elements of genetic construct have an impact on the way in which you react, and have an impact on the way in which you can reach out or not reach out. And if these receptors are present, for example, the arginine vasopressin receptor, AVPR1A, then you are likely to be categorized as an autistic person. And this receptor is linked to fear, and it's linked to anger, and sometimes unrestrained anger, and it is linked to other kinds of behavior. Now, there are other bases in scientific research about what we call the empathetic gene. There are several genes involved in this, and from Simon Baron-Cohen's perspective then, the fact that there's a genetic evidence for this kind of circuitry is then assumed to be the basis, the scientific basis for the argument that he is making. All right, so that I hope he will accept as a kind of half-hearted attempt to explain what it is that he is up to in his book. Now, what I want to do is to bring a critical view to this. If it is circuitry that develops your empathy, are you always the same way empathetically? That is, if this were hardwired into place, my argument is that it should have the same kind of reaction across all areas of your life. But in fact, it does not. For example, does love help you develop empathy? Well, it's sure better, or your spouse is going to be mighty angry. If you show the same empathy to your secretary as you do to your wife, you're in trouble. So in effect then, can you really develop empathy? Yes, you can develop empathy, and you can develop in a number of ways, and you can focus it on a number of issues and a number of elements in your life. So that means then that whatever empathy is and whatever circuit Simon is talking about, that empathy can be changed by your life situation and by your own particular will. That, to me, does not speak of a kind of circuitry that he has found to be the basis of evil. So here's a question for you. If you are not empathetic about something, are you necessarily bad? So there are all kinds of things that go on in this world that raises our levels of empathy. I'm sure you've looked in the newspapers and saw on television the dog that was killed just this week in Edmonton. So in the course of an arrest, the individual who was arrested slashed the police dog, and the police dog died. Well, the outpouring of empathy in Edmonton was extraordinary. Just about every media that I know of made a big deal about this. Now, there are some policemen that are killed on duty and all they get is a page. And many of them aren't even heralded that way. So does this mean that society is not empathetic? Yes. So if you're not empathetic, is that necessarily bad? What I'm trying to suggest is that evaluating empathy is a cultural product. It's much larger than trying to establish an electrical circuit in the brain. And here's one for you. If we ban the death penalty, does that mean that the state is empathetic? Can a state act empathetically? One would think that if we can hardwire empathetic behavior, then all states should be empathetic. They are not. And in fact, many states are anti-empathetic. So in effect, can one be super empathetic to the point of being dangerous? Well, what do you think? There are all kinds of stories about people trying to help, and they cause more trouble than enough. Either they don't know what they're doing, or they do the wrong thing. So, in effect, you can be over-empathetic, and maybe it could be very dangerous. So the final issue that I'd like to comment on is, if there is a circuitry like this, and if it explains the lack of empathy, can this be transmuted into what I think is a much larger category, and that is the category of evil? So I thought this would be interesting for you, and I want you to take a quick look at this. Imagining another in pain does not necessarily evoke empathy. So in this study by Desily and Chen and Herensky and Kiel, the MRI showed that there were affective perspectives, but that doesn't necessarily mean then that there is automatic behavior that is empathetic. So in effect then, your empathetic system can be operating, but you decide that you're not going to do it. So in effect then, the circuitry for whatever it is that Simon has been talking about, that this circuitry itself is subject to alteration and subject to modification. and perhaps personal will has an impact in that. Moreover, I want you to look a little broader then, and to look at the whole issue of where we come about to this notion of evil. Frankfurter's book in 2006 argued that the way in which we define evil relates to our history and culture and arises out of previous understandings of what it is that is evil. In effect, then, we only use the evil word when it's connected to a social phenomenon that has been established in the public mind as evil before that. So, in effect, then, when we try to establish the notion of the devil or an evil figure, all of this relates to a way in which we have evolved. So evolution plays a role in the whole definition of evil, and certainly in whether or not you are empathetic. Then look again at the social construction of evil. All of these things that we have talked about in terms of history, all of these things are culturally bound. In effect, then, apart from the world that we have become now, where we have 24/7 communications around the world, there are lots of examples of what we would call evil, but it is not endorsed by everybody. Moreover, the empathy that we are talking about, and the one that Simon Baron-Cohen points out with, I think, incredible passion, this notion of evil based on lack of empathy may only be a locally defined phenomenon. It may not have a what we would call a worldwide application. And the final nail that I would drive is the last one, that there is no notion of cruelty that is universal. All over the world, then, there are different constructions of what it is that is evil and what it is violent. And another dimension is added to this by looking back in history. So where did empires come from? And how did empires develop? Well, the most recent research says that war actually was a tool to construct empires. And therefore, the evil of war and destruction and death and violence is part and parcel of a socially constructed world called an empire. It therefore has a political and state dimension to it. So in effect, from my reasoning then, I would argue that the kind of thing that we associate with Hitler and other kinds of phenomenon in the West have been part and parcel of human history going back to the very first empire. So here's just some thoughts for you to think about. Is evil a realm? Now, when I was fighting with Georgie, I can tell you that I thought evil was a realm and that he belonged to it. I thought he was some kind of emissary of, this nether world. And there are more than one who argue that this whole, domain that we have now of the chaotic and the demonic reflects some of what I would call a cultural propensity to develop evil as a realm. So I would like to ask Simon who it is that defines evil. It's authorities. People say that is evil. Presidents, popes, prophets, So is Byron-Cohen an authority? And does that raise very interesting questions about his use of the term? Well, here's a couple of studies that really critique Baron-Cohen's thesis. The optimal income in individuals with a history of autism and inferring decoding strategies from choice indicates then two things. One, that people can outgrow autism. Secondly, that people adapt to autism and, in fact, adapt to empathetic behavior. So, from my conclusion then, there is no proof that cruelty, evil, or lack of empathy are one and the same set of phenomena. And many of these things that we're talking about really arises out of a social perception of evil. So, the perceptions of evil are real. I can tell you that when I got beaten up by Georgie, I knew that evil was present in the world. But I doubt very much if my designation of George Fluter as evil can be reduced to a model of lack of empathy. And my final point is that the variables in the human mind are so great, and the isolating one circuitry for me hardly explains it all. And in effect, I think if you look around, you will find that many of the aspects associated with empathetic behavior can be modified and can be changed because of love and assistance and what we would call crises of life. So that's all I've got to say on the topic, so have at me.
Yeah, I just want to say first off, that was a really great lecture, and you're a really dynamic speaker. It was really nice listening. I noticed that you knocked off pretty much a bunch of the questions that I had, so I guess I'll try and keep it short because I know other people want to talk. One of my questions was, I was wondering what you would think of maybe some certain fictional characters, like in different films, and how and their sort of evil and maybe lack of empathy, and how that relates to Baron-Cohen. So what I was thinking of, like, I can't remember the main guy's name in Citizen Kane, but it's the main guy, Kane. And he starts off really nice. He has all these aspirations, and his friends love him, and he's eventually corrupted, it looks like, and he sees people only as toys to manipulate. And I was wondering what your thoughts were on that, because that seems to go against what Baron-Cohen is saying, because at first it seems like he has empathy, and then later on he doesn't. I don't know if that,
yeah, I think that's a good point.
again, it is just a fictional character, but I think it illustrates a good point.
I understand what you, but then fiction has a nasty way of portraying truth, doesn't it? See, I think empathy is a real problem. I agree, you know, there is really some big issues here. I mean, if you've ever been divorced, you'll know that after you look at a previous spouse, you know, a year or two down the line, you say, what in God's name did I ever see in this person, you know? So what I'm trying to point out to you is that there's a kind of perspective that life dictates to you. And this kind of perspective provides what we would call a balance in terms of how we relate to people. And I think that what happens in divorce, for example, is that someone who you've cared for and loved and very deeply has become embedded in you your personality. That what you have to do then is to adjust in a way where they're out of your personality again. So let's say 5 years down the line, she comes to you, assuming that you're married to a female, she comes to you and says, look, I'm broke, I need some money. Well, if you say, tough titty, go get your money from wherever, are you lacking empathy? Now, as I read Baron-Cohen, he wants to argue that the empathetic circuitry that we're talking about has been short-circuited in some way, shape, or form. And that short-circuiting of the empathy circuitry can be explained by the fact that I say, no, I'm not going to give you $5. On the other hand, he has something going for him when he argues that the pathway of autism and the kind of lack of empathy that you see in autism speaks to a kind of regularized behavioral pattern. And I'm willing to accept that there's a regularized behavioral pattern there, but I don't want to bury it in the circuitry model, okay? Because I think putting it in a circuitry model commits us to a kind of behavioralist model of human understanding that I'm not willing to accept.
Okay. Yeah, I think I agree with that point too. One thing that I noticed in the talk too was, I haven't read the book, but he mentioned those specific genes, and to me that sounds like, it just seems pretty stupid to even bring those up, because it just seems like more of a way to sell books more than anything, because people can pick out, and I assume it's written in like a lay person's terms, right? Anybody can read it, sort of.
Yeah.
Yeah, so somebody's going to read it and then poke out and say, oh, there's this specific gene for that. And people love to tag specific genes to specific behaviors, but in reality, that doesn't work like that at all. Nothing is hardwired. There's a massive interaction. Genes get turned off and on all the time. And then to tie that to brain function is like a massive undertaking that I don't think anybody's really at the point where they can do that yet. Yeah. I don't think we don't even really have good models. He mentioned all the circuitry for autism and all these other behaviors, but we don't, at the end of the day, an fMRI only takes you so far. You can just see that there's activity, but you don't actually know what the neurons are doing themselves and how they're all interrelated. So I thought it was a pretty far shot from, I don't think he brought up the right sort of points to back what he was saying in terms of empathy. Although the one thing that I will give him, and maybe this is where you might disagree with me, is that I think at the end of the day, if you are talking about, evil as maybe a social construct or somehow, I do believe that it probably would somehow be represented within the brain at some point. I don't believe that it's necessarily a specific where you can point and say, oh, this specific brain area is not working. But I imagine that there would have to be some sort of cortical representation for some kind of an evil action, but I think that's years down the line from getting to that kind of research.
Okay, well, I have a few comments about this. First of all, you have to remember that Simon is a behavioral psychologist, okay? So behavioral psychology has, in effect, used what I would call scientific definitions and scientific type structures as a way of affirming much larger areas of human behavior and human expression than what technically I think a neuroscientist would do. Okay, so give him his credit. He's working from a particular perspective. He's dealing with families that have children, that burn their siblings and don't feel anything about it. And so he's got some tough cases to deal with. So he says, how are we going to explain this? And how are we going to explain it to to their moms and dads, right, who see the damage wreaked upon siblings by this individual. So you have to give him credit for trying to find the language of science as a psychological model that he can try to deal with this. So I'm looking here at the development of a particular framework of a discipline as an attempt to deal with a huge problem that he doesn't know how to deal with. Okay, so that's one thing. The second thing that I would say is that even if you apply the scientific model to his work, you'll find that the scientific model has so many assumptions built into it, right, when it comes to the circuitry of the human mind, that at any particular point in his argument, you could say, but aren't you assuming this or aren't you assuming that? So if you read his book, after a while, I gave up on the assumptions business because I just thought, well, he's working from a much larger perspective here than just this. Any other questions?
So my question is involving Jim Fallon and his work. Have you seen that at all?
Yeah.
Okay. So he sat there, he did all the MRIs, and he found that, yes, there is an actual physical component for the sociopaths. He also found that he himself had it, even though he hadn't actually committed any mass murders, and that his family also included mass murderers of fame like Lizzie Borden.
Yeah.
Is it possible then, are you suggesting because it's mutable that it might be an epigenome system where you can, through your actions, change it or your environment changes
Yes,
it?
I'm saying that by using the circuitry model, which I think is based on, you know, the kind of cell phone ideology that we have, you know, by having the notion of a circuit, you give it the kind of language of permanence that I don't think it has in the human brain. In other words, there are things that can intercept this lack of empathy. A number of things, an emotional overload of some sort can intercept that, and suddenly people will get another perspective on things. They'll see things differently. So in the argument that there is a circuitry, I find the whole use of that kind of language problematic when it comes to dealing with this behavior. The second thing that I find difficult is that people who are psychopaths seem able to modify their behavior and to fit in other situations when they want to. If in fact it was a circuitry issue, they wouldn't be able to do that. In other words, if the circuitry was that hardwired, how could you ever fit in? Because that means then that the brain is evaluating what you're doing and saying, look, in relationship to these people, you can't do that kind of behavior. You have to look as though you're okay. So in effect, the brain itself is overriding the whole notion of the circuit as the active and I would think significant way in which this pattern is carried out. And if you do that, then I don't know what the language of circuitry means. Now, when it comes to genetics, that may be a different thing. I don't know. Because it may be when you argue that the Maori have a genetic tendency to violence and a genetic tendency to be warriors. And when you look at their DNA, yes, they do in fact have this gene that very few other groups of people have. My problem is with the genetic thing is, but not everybody who is part of the Maori people expresses the genetic tendency to being a warrior in the same way, or is oriented towards the warrior syndrome. Whereas one would argue that if it is a genetic tendency, if it's rooted in a genetic activity, that maybe we're looking at something that can't be altered, can't be modified. But I'll have to leave that up to the geneticist to tell me, because I don't know.
So at the end of this lecture, I kind of got the idea that we have a long way to go before using science to explain evil in a more methodical way. What I guess I'm kind of asking is, how do you see the way forward? Like studying more cases of autism, is that going to provide any more insight, or is there a way to use science to study evil?
Oh, okay. You see, I see science as an expression of Western discourse. I mean, the kind of science that we're talking about now is really a product of Western ingenuity and development. It's part of the way the social and cultural system of the West have developed. It is now, of course, being taken over by other cultures and other peoples around the world. But the fact of the matter is that the creation and development of this scientific approach is a long and distinguished and very arduous process rooted in Western history. I don't think you can disengage Western science from the language of the West. Like, for example, the use of the word evil in a scientific context can't shed its religious overtones. So when you use the word evil, you are in effect calling up in the collective mind a whole host of images and perceptions and mythologies that have been so ingrained in Western consciousness that you can't say, oh, I'm only using evil like this. You know what I mean? That is, when you talk about science and you talk about the development of the West, you're talking about a religious discourse that has been embedded in the scientific discourse and in the regular discourse of Western culture, so that all of these resonances come in to play. I just think that there are real problems with making some kind of scientific statement then that the origin of evil, has this kind of basis. I find that so unscientific that I can't buy it, you see. That's my problem. And so maybe if he had just stuck to the whole issue of empathy and the ramifications of the lack of empathy, maybe I would have been much happier. But you can see why I disagree with the basic assumptions behind his book. A very creative book, incidentally, and you should get it out of the library and read it just for the hang of it. It's really very interesting. But the whole point is that for me, you can't disengage the use of science or evil from the historical and cultural and social development that created them, right? And so therefore, for science all of a sudden to come along in the 21st century and said, I know why you're thinking that way. I mean, it smells. And I just can't, I'm sorry, but I just can't buy it, so I'm a dissident. That's why I'm here. Okay, next question.
So mine would be mainly about the ability to override the circuitry. So would that mean like those who are using antidepressants, are they choosing not to override? Or because it's mainly about the whole idea of having a chemical imbalance in their brain.
Oh,
You know
that's
what
a
I
great,
mean?
that's a great question. I mean, especially since we know so bloody little about depression. Yeah, I mean, and what happens when you. I mean, the most recent research, let me say this before I go into my spiel. The most recent research that I can find on depression, and I have relatives with depression, so I've done a fair amount of work on it. The most recent research I find is that, you know, like, for example, a chemical or a medication taken for depression is ultimately not going to solve the problem. I mean, that depression is much deeper and rooted in much more complex systems of the human psyche and the human mind, so that what I would call a chemical mediation is not going to solve this issue. And so that's where I'm coming from. And the second thing I would say is that there's no doubt about autistic kids. They are often medicated significantly so that they don't hurt somebody, you know, and what does this do to them? I think probably psychologically it has an immense impact on them. And as people who have regularly been on antidepressants, and who, in the final analysis, say, you know, I don't know how I should feel about X, because I'm either full of this drug or I'm not sure it's me that's feeling this way. I don't know if you've had anybody in your family like this, but this is a very problematic area, because in some way it testifies to the fact that you can override the ill effects of depression through things like exercise and perhaps Zen meditation in ways that have not been tested scientifically, but which we know work. It's the same reason why I spend a great deal of my time in the center talking about traditional medicines, because traditional medicines deal with some issues better than some of the ways in which Western so-called scientific medicine has been able to deal with them. And when it comes to depression, the whole placebo effect just blows me right out of the water. I mean, people get off better on a placebo sometimes than they do on the medication, right? I mean, it's a really extraordinary phenomenon. But that means then that the mind kicks in and says, look, I'm taking a pill, so I'm going to be better. I'm going to be healed. I'm going to be fixed up. And that overrides whatever is going on. So, I don't know whether this rant got to your point or not, but it's a...
That was a great response. Thank you.
Yeah.
We face today, you know, something new, and that is, what does the NSA know about us?
Oh,
right?
Don't get me on that topic.
So you can imagine that a lot of the questions that we deal with in this course, you could have in the past said, well, how could you apply machine learning to this? And then you would just say, well, the data's not complete. But there could be even individuals in this room that, you know, the NSA knows everything about, and maybe you're sufficiently interesting that they're actually studying you, you know? And so, and even if that's not true today in 2013, it will become true that at least certain people, their entire lives will be documented 24/7 and everything about them known. And then, you know, machines, we talk a lot about machines doing things versus people, will come up with theories about some of this stuff, you know? This person with a life documented over decades did something terribly evil. What was different? What was the defining characteristic that led to that outcome? And just like, machine learning now, there's often a kind of black box component to it where you can't put everything into formulas. But ultimately, if you tried hard enough, once the machine has the basic insight, you can try to learn, how did it get to this insight? What is this about? So we have very interesting human ideas about the origin of things that are seemingly important to all of us, and we don't think these ideas are very sound. You can imagine a time when the data exists where theories can be generated by sentient machines, and they will probably have the answers. And then the question is whether we can understand what those answers are, So,
it's pretty obvious, right, that some people are sitting in jail now because NSA, connected this dot with that dot,
yes,
and this dot with that dot, and said, oh, this is a terrorist, he's got to go to jail. I mean, this is a machine telling us how we should run our country and how we should run our judicial system by judging this material as if it indicates something. Right.
And with the control of drones now, the big variable is waiting for the person controlling the drone to make the next decision. Be a lot better if you just take that person out of it and have the drone make its own, decisions. And
one probably will eventually.
Yeah. One can see that coming.
Yes. Well, for me, that day will never come. I mean, for me, I will be a dissident until I'm, under the sod.
Yeah.
Because I think that takes away my free will. It takes away, it really negates my humanity to argue that a machine can find one pattern in my existence that is definitory about me. The hell it is. It is not, right? So I could do something different tomorrow that I've never done in my life. And I think that's what makes us great.
No, I think if you look at Jonathan White's first video and most recent video, you see an example in this course of exactly that, And both are equally rational arguments. They're just arguments in a very opposite vein about exactly the same subjects. So the same thing could happen to Earle. He could get up tomorrow morning and say, I don't want to teach that class anymore. It just, it doesn't suit me. I may have seemed enthusiastic yesterday, but, I've changed my mind. And actually, it's a very Canadian thing. In Canadian medical practice, like if you're a physician trained in some other country, and you come here, and they're wondering, what are you going to do? So, crossing the border and getting into Canada, you make a statement like, yes, I'm trained as a physician, but I don't plan to practice medicine in Canada. But according to Canadian law, you can change that decision the very next day. I mean, just as long as what you say is what you believed at the time, that's fine. The next day you can wake up and say, well, I've been thinking about it, and actually I do want to practice medicine. And so, I think a lot of things like that can change. Okay, well, we're 3 minutes over time. Thank you for a really excellent teaching session.